this picture because I liked all the little squares and the little, you know, sections. So I thought it's a landscape, but it's such a different view from what we normally paint. So I thought it's almost a little bit abstract. So we will just make a little bit of a sketch and then just start to fill that all into these little sections. And some of these bushes, they're more rounded, and then the actual fields for farmers and stuff, they're very square. So I thought it'd be a really fun thing to paint. And we're going to mix up lots of different colors, green and brown, just to make sure that all these little sections have slightly different colors. So let me just make sure I'm sharp. I think that's all right. Lots of charcoal in my hands. There we are. And I was thinking of using the paint quite thick today to get really that that sense of, you know, a bit like that blanket sort of effect. So I think I'll use my gouache fairly thick to sort of layer it a little bit and to yeah, to see if we can really get that sort of blanket effect that you get when you look at the sky from above. I always find it really funny when I'm in an airplane. I try not to fly too much anymore, but sometimes you do. It's quite a long time for me. But when you fly over the Netherlands, all the entire country is super square, and you have these really big fields with grain or whatever they're growing, and it's these really like super square long areas. And in England you have all these little hedges and paths and everything is a little bit sort of windy, and I really like that. I find that it always looks much prettier when you fly over England. I instantly think like, oh, I'm back here again, back home. So I might add in a few lines, just the main ones. So here it's going to be some bushes, so maybe this is a bit of a foresty area as well. I'm looking at that photo for inspiration, but I'm not copying it exactly. I'm not going to count out how many of those squares there are, or how, yeah, exactly how it is in the photo. I'm just going to use it a bit to inspiration and for the colors as well. So this is as much of a sketch that I'm going to make. I know it's a little bit vague. This is sort of the path or the river. I reckon it might be a river. I thought it was a road at first, but I reckon it might be a river. And then a few lines for the sections. So I don't use my flat brush very often, but I think it might come in handy today. But I will have my round brush ready as well. So there we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is just mix up a few different colors green, and I'm thinking of starting with the forest areas and then from there on start filling in these square sections. I think the forest, maybe this is like a little campsite or something, I don't know, something like that. I'm going to start with these forest areas because that might feel a little bit more familiar than all these straight lines. So I already have a little bit of green here. I want a bit more, and you can always mix green by adding yellow and blue together. So if you only have one color green in your selection, now you can always add a little bit of yellow to it or add a bit of blue to it, or mix up green completely by mixing up some yellow. So maybe if I add some yellow here, and then some blue, and just see what color green I get by mixing those two. So that's actually not too different from the color. I have sort of a color quite similar to that, but it's quite fun to sort of see what color you get with your sort of primary yellow and your primary blue. Because sometimes it's a very different color from the mix that you have sort of standard. So and let me see what tubes of green I have as well. I have some light green. I think these two are the same color. Yeah, they are indeed. So I'm going to use this one. So I'm just laying out some extra colors as well. I might actually add some directly to my palette because I think I'm going to use my paint quite thick. If that happens where you have a bit of sort of water or oil coming out of the tube first, that's absolutely fine. In theory, you would sort of mix it up again. You can't shake these tubes very well, but you can still use that paint. There's no, it doesn't matter. Sometimes it just sort of collects on the surface, so to say. There we go. You ready to start painting? I can see you. Yeah, wonderful. So I think I'm going to get started with my round brush because I'm started on these. I'm going to start on the foresty areas, and I think the round brush works better there. And then once I have filled those areas in, I'm going to get started with my flat brush and see what that, what that looks like to make those nice sort of straight areas. So I've sort of mapped that out a little bit in my sketch, and I'm using a bit of a dapping motion. So I'm using my paint quite thick today. I want the colors to be really vibrant. So not too much water, really gouache style. Thinking a little bit of that texture of what this forest looks like from above. So it's like lots of little dots. You can almost see the individual trees. I might add in some shadows there later on to make them feel even a little bit more like trees. You can see that there are some shadows in between the trees. So where the white of the paper shines through, I think I will add some black or some really dark colors, some shadows there later on. So maybe I'll mix the colors up a little bit. Some of this dark bluish green. And that edge, I don't want it too straight because that forest, those trees are round, so the edges of that area, it's okay if they're a little bit sort of frayed or a little bit rounded. I think this is a little bit too blue, so I'm adding in a little bit of this lighter green. Because this is all fairly dry, the colors do mix up a little bit together, but it's more layering than blending. The more water you add, the more those colors will naturally blend in together. You could paint this wet on wet as well, but today I've decided not to. Something like that, if you make the paper wet and the colors would all blend in together. For something like that forest, that would work quite well. For the squares of the fields, that'd be much harder because I want the edges to be fairly sharp. So, I have no idea where this is in the world. I don't know, somewhere with farmland. It could be anywhere, couldn't it? So I'm just seeing where I'm going to map these colors, get a little bit of an idea of the layout. Maybe I want this to be a little bit less blue and a little bit more light green. I do think the forests generally have a slightly darker color than the fields around it, so that's why I started with some darker greens. But I think might be slightly more mossy yellow-green than what I've used so far, but it's okay. I can always go over it and change the tone a little bit later on. So, and here, because there's all these like little houses and stuff in there, I'm going to keep a little bit of free space. So maybe I'll put some of these trees on the edge. I'll leave a little bit of space free to add in some like little red rooftops or something like that later on. So. The size of my paper is actually quite similar to the size of the photo. I think the photo is just a little bit narrower. I'm going to add in some of these bushes here at the top as well, because I have the space and it sort of makes sense. So, a little bit here. And I'm already noticing that those tree lines, they cast some shadows over the fields. I'll look at that all the way at the end, so don't worry about the shadows and about those, yeah, these trees here, they cast some shadows as well, and we can sort of see where the light is coming from here on this field. But don't worry about that, we can get to that later. This is the first time I'm doing a photo from above like this, and I find it quite fun actually. Never before picked an aerial view such as this. There we go, just putting my brush down for a moment. See if I sort of start to visualize a little bit where I'm going. Doesn't have to be perfect yet, so I'm just making sure I'm a little bit sharper. Yeah, I think that's as sharp as I can get it. So the flat brush. I know we've not really used flat brushes in any of the classes before. You might just use it sometimes yourself. I don't actually know. Maybe you sometimes know, never. And the great thing about a flat brush is that you have two ways of using it. So you can use it flat, like this. So let me take a little bit of brown so it's a bit easier to see. So maybe a little bit thicker than that. So say I'm doing these brown squares here. You can keep your brush flat like this and create this really sort of straight line. Or you can keep your brush sort of a bit more upright and create really fine stripes with them. Today we're probably only going to use our brush sort of really flat like that, or on the side to make stripes. But if you would do any other type of painting, you could do, well actually I can paint over it in a moment. So you can make lines with it where you sort of create line variety by changing the angle of your brush. Which is a little bit different, sort of similar to when you have a round brush, you press down on it harder and your line becomes thicker. You can do that a little bit by twisting your brush. I don't think we'll really be doing that today because all the edges seem to be quite similar in shape. I'll just let that dry and then paint over it. But it's quite yeah, sometimes the lines that you can create with a flat brush on its edge can be a little bit sharper than with a round brush. So it can be quite fun to practice with and just to see if there's something that you like. So I'm just mixing up a little bit of brown colors because I started in that corner. That way the colors of the forest can dry a little bit before I start adding green areas there. So I'm just going to make my lines a little bit thicker. This is a very deep brown. Maybe I can add a little bit of water to my paint, just a slightly bit more see-through. So, and we sort of need to decide how large these squares are going to be. And it's okay if some are a little bit bigger than others, some are a little bit narrower, but they need to feel sort of in proportion to each other. So I think this size of square is sort of my base square. Maybe I've zoomed in a little bit more than what I've done, than what we've done in the photo. So I'm just going to start adding some of these sections in. And you can see I've added some pink color to my browns. I find that brown and pink go together really well. It's sort of the natural gradients of skin colors, isn't it? And that just goes together really well. So if you want to add a little bit of pink in the ground somewhere, you can absolutely do that as well. I think it feels quite natural. So the trick is to not let the colors bleed out too much. So how much water do you want to use? Or how dry do you want to use your paint? You can leave a little bit of a white edge between two squares if you want to. Let it dry a little bit before you fill it up, and there's maybe some green hedges in between later. So if you leave a little white edge in between, you can always fill that up with a little bit of green later on. You've got all these hedges in between the fields. I definitely don't think this is the Netherlands because of all these tiny little squares. Maybe it's in England or in France or somewhere in America. I don't know. I imagine America would have really large fields as well, but I don't actually know if that's true. I don't know if you notice that the way the paint goes on the paper when you use a flat brush is a little bit more, I find it feels a bit more even. I don't know if you find that it just feels a little bit more, I don't know, like each of these strokes has a very even application, just a little bit different from a round brush. So I'm mixing in a little bit of green with my brown just to create different colors. And I'm just really going to take our time, start filling this in. So, turn that bleeping off. And when you do something like this, you can almost make a little bit of a gradient where you use sort of the same paint and just keep adding a little bit of color to it, or go so for example have that brown, add a little bit of green to it, add a bit more green to it. You can almost create like a gradient in that field, or you can go with really opposite colors next to each other. So we can change the look of the picture a little bit depending on what you, what sort of look you want to go for. I think the more you create a gradient, the calmer the look of your painting is going to be, and the more you sort of color block it, so really different colors next to each other, sort of busier your painting is going to look. I think both are really fun. You can play around with it a little bit, see what you prefer. I'm staying with quite sort of earthy tones, but you can definitely also add in some fantasy tones if you want. So if you want to add in a red square somewhere, maybe they're growing flowers there, you can make it up a little bit. I was planning to keep it fairly close to the photo. I can totally imagine that people would, you know, mix it up a little bit and create something more colorful. So and if you look at the, a little bit over that edge, if you look at the lines of these fields, I think they sort of seem to keep that diagonal line, at least all the way on this side of the river. These lines in between the squares, they seem to go all in this sort of diagonal way. And then on the other side of the river, the lines are a slightly different angle. So I'll do this side first, and then yeah, have a look, see if I want to change it at all on the other side. So. And if two of these squares are both wet next to each other, the colors blend in a little bit sort of automatically. Yeah, if you want to avoid that, keep a little bit of space in between, or add some squares on another side where it is dry already. But also I quite like the look. Now it's actually happened, I think, oh, that looks quite nice. So there's a little bit of freedom in that as well. I want some more green in my picture. I think it's getting a little bit brown. Zoom out. Some. And I have these green colors that I added to my palette, but I want the field to be a little bit more yellow than that. So I'm just going to see if I can add a little bit more yellow to those greens. See if I can make it a little bit more vibrant. I'm going to skip a few places and maybe start here. So. See, with a bit of yellow you instantly create a very different look. And the field here almost seems like a little bit less squared. It has some square edges where it goes over in that farmland, but this might just be a bit grassy sort of field. I don't know, I'm sort of imagining. That's what I'm seeing in it. So maybe that's a little bit larger. I think this is quite a soothing painting, not it's almost a little bit like we're creating an abstract color, like a mood board of some kind. I heard about this knitting practice that people do, where they paint according to what weather it is. It's like a temperature blanket, and then every day you knit one row in the color that you think the weather sort of represents that day. And it looks really nice. So you often have, like, if you do it for an entire year, you'd have like lots of sort of cool colors in the winter, and then slowly a gradient, like a bit of a rainbow, towards really warm weather, and then slowly sort of cooler colors again. Or you can do it on intensity, so you do only blue, but then really intense colors for really warm weather, and really soft blues for cold weather. I thought, well, it's a lot of work, but I never heard of it. I didn't know this was a thing. So that's what we're doing now, just with paint. You could do like a little painting where you do 1 square of paint every day for the weather. So I don't know if anyone does that, but I can imagine people do. So and I'm just going over that edge of the forest a little bit. I think I will tidy up those edges a little bit more on my second layer and make those trees a little bit more defined and make them stand out a little bit more. So this is a strange color where I added a bit of pink and red to green, and that creates a brown color. So it's a slightly strange color. I quite like it. When you do these sort of muddy fields, it's okay to experiment with color a little bit, because as you can see, some from the sky look a little bit more purple. A tiny bit. I think this one a little bit more brown. So, and here on the edge, I want it to feel quite sharp along where the river. So, the edge of the river, I want it to feel quite sharp. So, just these last few areas here, and then I'm going to have a look on the other side. So, you can see I did not tape my paint today, and I'm going all the way to the edge. It's not too wet, so it shouldn't buckle too much. So, all those little white areas, I will fill those in later on with some brown or some green. So I'm just going to do a similar sort of shaping, similar sort of effect on this side. But it seems to be a little bit more brown and purple colors here. And also the line seems to be going a little bit more upright. So the way they sort of go with the tractors over the field is probably in a slightly different direction here. You sort of see that line going in that direction and there, sort of like this. And then here it's a little bit more angled, maybe a bit more up. There's a bit of a curve in it as well. So if you want, you can tilt your paper if you find it easier to get to the other side. Oops. And my camera is back. I'll just keep my paper like this and just adjust my hands. But if you find it a bit easier to tilt it, you can absolutely do so. So I think I'll just start here at the top. Maybe make my squares a little bit smaller. I quite like that sort of curve that I see in there. Maybe a little bit more beige. My palette will be covered with lots of little dots of different colors at the end. You can also add a little bit of grey in if you want. A bit of grey to your green or to your brown just really lightly changes the color. You can do a few squares in one color if you want. Just keep in mind sort of what direction you are planning to go into. You can see sometimes squares are a little bit bigger or a little bit larger. That line is not, it's not just one straight continuous line from one side to the other. Sometimes there's suddenly two fields that are the size of one. Something else that I learned this week is that, I don't know, I think every part of the world has like 3 random words assigned to it. And if you phone emergency services, you can say, you can just look up on an app or something what the words for your, like it's per square meter, per 3 square meters or something. I kept the color scheme a little bit more sort of muted, and I actually quite like that.
Yeah.
And this side has a bit more bolder colors, and this side has a little bit more softer colors. And then there's this big, I think this whole part is almost like a big field, isn't it? I might just add that in all in one go. It's quite soothing making all these little squares, isn't it? So, I think I'm going to do the river. And it has that really sort of pale beige color, very opaque. And I think I might see a little boat on there as well, or maybe something else floating in the river. I might add that in all the way at the end. Maybe a little bit bigger than what it is in the photo. I like the idea of a boat being on there, sort of from the top. So I'm just going to make the whole river a really pale beige color. And I have some brown that I can use for that. So I'm using quite a lot to mix up this color, and then some white. So I'm just making that much lighter. I might just dry it up a little bit. And I'm mixing quite a lot because I know it's quite a large area that I want to cover with it, so I don't mind if it's a little bit much. So yeah, maybe this color just light brown with some white in it. So this is all dry, so I can start here. And it's just a very pale, sort of opaque color, that river. There's no waves or shine, or it's just, there's a little bit of shadows that we can add in at the end, but it's a very even color, and gouache is really good for even application. The only thing is, if you've not mixed enough and you need to mix more, then yeah, the color might be a little bit different. Which is also not the end of the world. I'm just doing the middle first, and then I'll do the edges. A bit more precise. Be careful going around that edge. So I'm going to add in a few of these little rooftops here in sort of red colors. There's a lot of white there in the photo as well, but I think I'll just simplify it a little bit and add a bit of red in there. And then see if I can create a little bit more depth in the picture. So by adding shadows and adding these little sort of hedges in between, and sort of see if I can, because it's a very flat picture so far, see if I can make it a little bit more three-dimensional by maybe giving some of the trees a little bit more texture. Yeah, maybe some hedges in between. I can also see a few of these squares that maybe have some stripes or something, because there's something growing there. So I might add in a few rows of vegetables on some of them. I'm just going to slowly see if I can make it a little bit more, yeah, a little bit more depth in it. I'm going to start with these little roofs, and I think I'm just going to go very traditional, just to add some little bit of red. I think red rooftops is always good, isn't it? Always clear. So I don't even know if you'd really recognize it as a rooftop. But we're going to try. So I'm going to let that dry, and I might fill in the rest with green. So maybe there's some darker green here. I left these white, but actually I'm going to make the rest of this forest a bit darker. So in some of these fields they might have some hedges in between. So just with the side of my brush, so and create some fine lines. See if I can make some separations between these squares. And I think the trick is to do it not everywhere, but leave some open to be sort of naturally connected, and then some would have a bit of a hedge in between. So I added some white to my green to make it sort of mint green. Yeah, it's a bit of a mix between like an army green, like a mossy sort of green, and then with some white it is a bit more mint green now. So it's a different color than what I've used so far. I did not add any white to my green so far. But adding some white can make it a slightly more minty color. And I don't want to leave too much white on the paper. Most of those squares, there's not really much white in there, so I'm going to see if I can fill up most of those white edges with some green. If there's like a little dot somewhere, then that's fine. So I do think this is a topic specifically good for gouache, because if you use sort of watercolor and lots of water, all of this would really easily bleed out into each other, and it'd be much harder to create those square sections. So maybe some lighter colors here in the trees here and there. So just filling this up a little bit more. I'm still looking at that photo, but I'm sort of letting that go a little bit. I don't know if you've noticed this in your own painting, but I'm sort of trying to find something, because here I actually quite like having those white lines in between, so I'm sort of thinking of leaving those on that side, even though in the photo that's all filled up and there's sort of something else in between. So I've not quite decided yet. I'll leave it as it is for now and then have a bit of a look at it later on. You don't always have to decide immediately. So some darker colors in between the trees. It's definitely a little bit abstract. All my trees are just little dots and the fields are squares. So, and I added some black here, but I find it a little bit too harsh. So I'm just going over there with a bit of a wet brush, a clean wet brush, and just blending it out a little bit. I can blend it in with a paint that's already on the paper. So, I think I'm going to put my flat brush aside for a moment and start adding a bit of shadows to some of these trees. And the light is clearly coming sort of from above, from I'm imagining that's the north, but that's not necessarily true. So this side of the world, the top of the page would be the north. But there's here along those tree edges, there's quite a lot of shadow. Here on the water, those trees are casting shadow. Here on the water underneath that bend. And then here, sort of everywhere where the sort of sun would cast a shadow from above. And what I'm going to do is just quickly feel if my paper is dry, and it is in most places. So here at the top it's dry. This in the middle, these trees are still really wet, but here in the bottom it's dry. So I can add quite a sort of wet wash over that to create those shadows without it instantly blending in. But I need to make sure I don't rub it too much, because this is quite thick layers of paint. And the more water I use, the more it's likely to reactivate that paint and blending in together. So I want to mix up a little bit of really watery black. So a bit more water, maybe a tiny bit of grey in it, maybe a tiny bit of blue in it. I like my shadows to have a little bit of color, but it's going to be a very watery paint. So I don't know if you can really tell, because it tends to sort of clump together, but if I move it around, it's very, very watery. Very different from the paint I've used so far. Wipe off the excess of my brush. And with that watery paint, I'm just going to go here underneath those edges, and just starting to add a little bit of shadow. Maybe here. I think there's a bit of blue in those shadows in the photo as well. Which is why I added a little bit of blue to the paint. So shadows are not often pure black, there's usually a little bit of color in. So I add that really watery paint to these areas where I feel there's some shadows. But you want to do it quite quick and not rub the paper too much, because the more you're rubbing, the more likely it's going to mix up with the colors that you already had there. So there. Because I use my paint very watery, it's going to let the color from whatever is underneath shine through. And that way it sort of blends in with the picture. It's not something you're lying on top really harshly. So maybe a bit there. Here on that tree edge. So you can always do a second layer if you want it to be a little bit darker. Just make sure you don't rub the paper too much, because gouache can always be reactivated. It's a bit different when you paint with acrylics, for example, and every layer dries up as a layer of plastic basically, and you can paint over it without disturbing what's underneath. There's something called Acrylic Gouache, which I think works in the same way, but I've never used it. I always use the sort of water-based gouache, which reactivates when you make it wet. So I'm just lifting my paper a little because I did not tape it to a board and I want the edges to have paint on them. So I'm just lifting it a little bit and just going over those edges to give them a bit of color. So I don't usually paint edge to edge. I usually have a bit of a white area around the sides. So just taking a little bit of distance, see if I want to add in a bit of more of a pop of color somewhere. I think this side is very pale, but I quite like it. I think I might just keep it like that, but in the photo that's quite a bit darker. Those colors brown are a bit more dark than I made them. And sort of the more I was painting, the more my paint got diluted and the lighter it became. I think maybe a bit more of a yellow green here, a slightly more brighter look. So let me add some yellow to this green that I have here. That's a little bit too much. I can add a little bit more green. Some, especially here, there could be some of that lighter green. Just make the whole feel a little bit brighter, maybe slightly more sunny. So I'm just adding that to whatever layers I already had. Changing the tone a little bit. So maybe here on the edge of the water, it's a bit brown now. If I make that green, I can see the difference between the water and the blend a little bit better. So there we go. I can sort of imagine going in there with pen a little bit once I'm all finished and adding some more details with pen. But I can't do it now because it is all wet. But I do want to have a little boat on the river. So I'm going to use a small brush. I think then I'm almost finished. But yeah, a small round brush. And then some dark paint. So say some black here. I'd like to test it out to make sure it has the right consistency. Let's say the boat is going to be here. This is just from above. Oh, that's a bit dark. That's right, I can just soak it up a little bit. Just making my tissue paper wet and just, so that's better.